A small-town saloon filled with smoke, whiskey, and tired laughter fell silent when the sheriff's young bride broke down in tears. Her grief was heavier than the guns hanging on every hip, and the gambler in the corner felt the weight of her sorrow like a bullet through his chest. What she mourned was not just a man, but the life stolen from her by betrayal. The gambler's card-stained hands trembled as he chose to stand. Jonas Hale never set out to be a gambler. His father had been a blacksmith in Missouri, his mother a schoolteacher who believed that words could build bridges stronger than iron. But when the war ended and hunger ruled the land, Jonas found that cards filled his belly faster than honest labor ever could. By the time he rode west, his hands had forgotten the hammer and the book. They only knew the feel of paper, chips, and the occasional pistol grip when debts turned bloody. He told himself it was survival, nothing more. Yet every night he shuffled those cards. He wondered if he'd already lost the game he was born to play. Silverton was a mining town clinging to the edge of dust and desperation. The saloon, the Copper Star, sat at its heart like a beating drum. Tonight the place smelled of sweat, spilled whiskey, and tobacco smoke so thick it stung the eyes. Men laughed too loud, their voices sharpened by liquor and loneliness. A piano banged out a crooked tune in the corner, its keys missing more teeth than the players who slapped them. Jonas sat at a table near the back, watching the crowd through the haze, his cards spread before him like a shield. He liked shadows. They kept him hidden from the kind of men who wanted his blood or his luck. The sheriff's bride, Clara Boone, had only been in Silverton for a year. Folks still whispered about her in the way small towns do, curious if she was too fine for this land or too fragile for its weight. She was younger than her husband by near 15 years, a girl who once dreamed of homesteads and children, but found herself married into law. Sheriff Boone was not unkind, but his life was danger, and danger does not keep warm company. Tonight Clara had come into the saloon dressed plain, her hair tied back, her eyes carrying something broken that made men drop their gaze. She sat at the far end of the bar, quiet, until the moment her glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor. The sound cracked through the room, sharper than any gunshot. The piano stopped. Laughter thinned. Every head turned. Clara's shoulders trembled as she pressed her face in her hands, the sobs breaking free without shame or restraint. The sheriff's wife was crying in the lamplight, and in the West, that was a thing men did not know how to face. Jonas felt something stir inside him, something older than cards and whiskey. He had seen widows cry at gravesides, mothers weep as soldiers marched away, even men bury their faces when their sons did not come home. But this was different. This was a cry that cut through smoke and pride and left silence heavy on the room. Jonas set his cards down. His fingers trembled, not from drink, but from a pull he did not understand. A man at the bar leaned close to Clara. Ben Crowley, a cattle broker with more gold than decency, smirked as he whispered something in her ear. Clara pulled back, but he caught her wrist. "A sheriff's widow needs a friend," he said, his voice loud enough to sting the quiet. Gasps scattered across the room. The sheriff, alive just that morning, was already being spoken of in past tense. Jonas rose before he could stop himself. His chair scraped across the floorboards, the sound rough and final. The crowd shifted, hungry for a scene, for a fight that might burn away the tension. Jonas moved toward the bar, his boots striking wood in steady rhythm. Crowley turned, eyes narrowing at the stranger who dared to stand against him. "Let the lady be," Jonas said, his voice low, steady. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words fell out like truth pulled from his ribs. Crowley laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And who are you to tell me so? Some card sharp with whiskey on his breath? The sheriff ain't here to protect her now." Jonas looked at Clara, her tear-streaked face lifted just enough to meet his eyes. He saw no plea in her gaze, only raw pain, and it was enough. He stepped between her and Crowley, placing himself where no one else dared. Crowley's grin faded. He shoved Jonas hard, but Jonas didn't stumble. The room buzzed like a hive ready to break. Jonas kept his hand at his side, close to the pistol he rarely used but always carried. Crowley's hand twitched near his belt. The whole room leaned forward. Then Clara spoke, her voice trembling but sharp as glass. "Stop it, please. Both of you." The words cut through the tension, but the damage was done. Jonas knew men like Crowley. This wasn't finished. Crowley spat on the floor, muttered a curse, and stormed out, his boots kicking dust into the night. The saloon exhaled as if the danger had passed, but Jonas knew better. Trouble never walked out the door without circling back. Clara pulled her wrist free and turned away, ashamed of her tears in front of so many. Jonas didn't follow her with words, but he stayed close, a silent shadow in the smoke. The barkeep poured her another drink, softer this time, and Jonas returned to his table without touching his cards. His eyes never left her. The twist came moments later, when two deputies pushed through the swinging doors, their faces pale beneath their hats. One carried a folded telegram. The words spread quick, carried by whispers faster than wildfire. Sheriff Boone had been ambushed on the North Trail. His body lay outside town, riddled with bullets, his badge stolen. The deputies' voices cracked as they told it, but the meaning was clear. The law of Silverton was dead. The room turned to Clara, who sat frozen on her stool. Her tears were no longer a mystery. They were prophecy. She had known before the others, felt it in her bones, or seen the sign of it in the silence Boone carried the day he rode out. Now the truth sat heavy in the air. Silverton was a town without a sheriff, and a widow sat alone in the lamplight. Jonas felt the weight press down harder than any debt. He did not know this woman, not truly, but something bound him to her grief. Perhaps it was the years of watching the world chew people up and spit them out, or perhaps it was the way her cry had torn through him like a bullet. Either way, Jonas Hale, gambler and drifter, had stepped into something he could not walk away from. He stayed seated long after the others turned back to their drinks, his mind restless, his chest tight. He thought of his mother's voice, warning him once that a man could run from many things, but not from the sound of a woman's grief. He had laughed at her then. He wasn't laughing now. Clara rose from the bar, her glass empty, her face pale. She walked toward the door with a silence that carried more power than any scream. Jonas watched her go, watched the swing of the doors swallow her into the night. He told himself to stay seated, to finish his drink, to shuffle his cards and forget. But when the silence grew unbearable, he found himself standing again. The night air outside was cold, the kind that cut through a man's coat and settled in his bones. Clara stood near the hitching post, her hand resting on the saddle of her husband's horse. The animal shifted, uneasy, as if it too knew its master was gone. Jonas stepped out onto the boardwalk, his boots heavy on the planks. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only language the West respected. Clara turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, strangers bound by the same cruel night. Then she spoke, her voice raw. "They'll come for me now. You know that, don't you?" Jonas swallowed hard, the truth sinking deep. He did know. A sheriff's widow was a mark, a piece of land with no fence, a flame in the dark that drew wolves closer. And he, a gambler with no home, no badge, and no right, had already stepped across a line he could not retreat from. He nodded once, slow, and she understood. Neither of them said more. The lamplight flickered behind them, and the night stretched wide ahead. Jonas Hale felt the weight of choice pressing down heavier than any hand of cards he had ever played. He knew before the night ended he would have to decide if he was truly willing to stand by the sheriff's bride or die trying. The gambler walked into the night carrying a promise he never expected to make. Through dusty trails and burning sunsets, he found himself guarding the sheriff's bride from enemies seen and unseen. A bond began to grow, built on silence by the fire and the quiet sharing of bread and stories. But shadows from the gambler's past rode closer with every mile. Jonas Hale had not meant to follow Clara Boone out of the saloon, but his boots carried him anyway. She moved like a woman walking in a dream, her steps steady though her body shook. The sheriff's horse stood restless at the hitching post, the leather reins hanging loose. Clara's hand rested on the saddle horn, her knuckles pale in the lamplight. Jonas stopped a few feet away, unsure if words would only make things worse. The silence between them was heavier than the night air, and in that silence Jonas felt the line of his life bend. Clara finally turned toward him, her face streaked with tears. "They'll come for me," she said, her voice hoarse but certain. "You know they will. You took the badge, and now I'm just something left behind." Jonas had no answer, because she was right. Outlaws never left the families of lawmen untouched. Sometimes it was cruelty, sometimes fear, but always it was to prove the badge meant nothing. Jonas swallowed and nodded once. That was all. By dawn the deputies had confirmed the sheriff's death, and the town wore grief like a ragged cloak. Clara returned to her small house on the edge of Silverton, and Jonas should have gone back to his drifting life. But something held him. He found himself waiting near her porch that evening, smoking a cigarette he barely tasted, listening to the coyotes cry from the hills. When she stepped outside, lantern in hand, she saw him there. She didn't ask why. She didn't send him away. The next days blurred into a rhythm Jonas hadn't known in years. He cut wood for her stove. He mended the fence her husband had meant to fix. He sat on the porch in silence while she cooked meals too small for two. She never thanked him directly, but she didn't have to. Her eyes, tired and red, softened when she passed him the bread. At night he would roll out his blanket by the barn, pistol close at hand, because the thought of leaving her unguarded twisted his gut. The town noticed. Men whispered in corners, and women watched from behind curtains. A gambler and a widow were not the kind of story Silverton liked to see, but Clara did not bend to gossip, and Jonas never cared for other people's judgments. What he cared about was the feeling in his chest every time she looked at him, as if she saw more than the cards and debts, as if she saw a man who had not yet failed. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the land glowed red, Jonas sat by the fire he had built near the barn. Clara joined him, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. She handed him a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire their only music. After a long while, Clara spoke. He was not perfect, Boone. He carried the law like a burden, not a gift. But he tried. He tried every day. Her voice wavered, but she held it steady. Jonas listened, staring into the flames. He thought of the men he had known who wore badges and the ones who had killed them. He thought of the graves they filled. He did not tell her that in the West, trying was often just another way to die. That night she asked him a question that froze him where he Saturday. "Why are you here, Jonas?" He wanted to say he didn't know, but the truth pressed hard against his tongue. "Because I couldn't walk away." The fire popped between them, sparks rising like stars. Clara lowered her gaze, and for the first time since her husband's death, her lips curved into the smallest, saddest smile. The days stretched on, and Jonas began to think maybe he had found a place to rest. But the West does not allow rest for long. The twist came 3 nights later. As Jonas kept watch under a half-moon, the sound of horses carried across the plains. He rose, hand on his pistol, and counted at least 4 riders moving fast toward town. They didn't stop at the saloon or the store. They rode straight past, toward the widow's house. Jonas stepped into the yard, his shadow long under the moonlight. Clara came to the porch, lantern shaking in her hand. "Who is it?" she whispered. Jonas didn't answer. He knew. The badge stolen from Boone's chest had marked her, and the men who killed him had come to finish the work. The riders slowed, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. One called out, voice thick with mockery, "Sheriff Boone's widow. Shame to see you all alone out here." Clara stiffened, but Jonas moved to the steps, his pistol drawn, the fire in his chest hotter than fear. "You'll ride on," Jonas said, his voice steady though his heart hammered. "Or you'll bleed here." The men laughed, their horses stamping the dirt. "And who the hell are you?" one asked. Jonas thought of 100 lies, but none felt right. So he gave them the truth. The man who swore to keep her breathing. The night tensed, every second stretching thin. Clara's lantern flickered. Jonas kept his pistol level. Finally, the leader spat into the dirt and turned his horse. "Not tonight," he said, his voice promising they would return. The riders wheeled and vanished into the dark. When the dust settled, Clara's hands shook so hard the lantern nearly fell. Jonas caught it, set it down, and took her by the shoulders. She stared up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but burning with something more. "They'll kill you for this," she whispered. Jonas shook his head. "They'll try." From that night forward, the oath was no longer silent. It lived in every step Jonas took, every watch he kept, every breath he drew beside her. He was no longer just a gambler drifting from town to town. He was a man tied to a promise, a man with something worth dying for. But as the days passed, shadows from his past began to stir. Old debts, old enemies, men who remembered Jonas Hale not as a protector, but as a cheat, a thief at the card table, a man who had once left others bleeding in the dust. They were riding too, and they were coming fast. Jonas knew the oath he carried was more than just guarding Clara Boone. It was standing against the weight of everything he had ever run from. And for the first time in years, he felt the cards in his hand trembling, knowing the next deal might cost him his soul. The fire burned low that night, and Clara sat close, her head bowed. Jonas watched the flames die and felt the cold creep in. He did not tell her of the men chasing his shadow. He only told her that as long as he breathed, she would not fall. But as he spoke, he wondered if he was making a promise he could never keep. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Somewhere beyond the hills, the riders who had killed Boone waited. And somewhere further still, men from Jonas's past spurred their horses west. The gambler's oath had been spoken, but in the west, words were nothing without blood to back them. Jonas Hale knew before long he would have to pay the price. The outlaw riders arrived, and the river became a grave for the innocent. Gunfire echoed across the valley, and the gambler's promise turned to blood-soaked reality. The sheriff's bride faced the cruel truth. Protection came at cost, and every man who swore loyalty carried his own ghosts. One choice had to be made, between vengeance and mercy, between escape and surrender. The days after the threat at Clara Boone's porch passed in uneasy silence. Jonas Hale never let his hand stray far from his pistol, and every creak of saddle leather or bark of a dog at night made him tense. Clara tried to hold to her routine, sweeping the porch, boiling coffee, feeding the sheriff's horse, but she knew the rhythm of her life was broken. Jonas stayed close, sleeping by the barn, guarding the place as if it were his own. Neither of them spoke about the riders who had come and promised to return. The silence said enough. One evening, Clara stood by the window while Jonas sat at the table, eating the bread she had baked. Her voice was quiet, but sharp with truth. "You can't guard me forever." Jonas set the bread down, staring at the worn wood beneath his hands. "I can try." The words sounded stubborn, even foolish, but he meant them. Clara turned her gaze back outside, her shoulders rigid. "They'll come harder next time. You know that." She was right. The next morning tracks appeared near the river, deep and fresh. Jonas followed them, crouching low to study the churned mud. The riders had been there at dawn, maybe earlier. He returned to the house with his jaw set. "They're circling," he told her. Clara's eyes darkened, but she didn't flinch. "Then we should stop waiting." By noon, they were riding out together, Clara on her husband's horse, Jonas on a dark gelding he had bought with his last winnings from the saloon. They carried little, some food, blankets, and a revolver Jonas cleaned every night. Clara held Boone's old rifle, the wood worn smooth from years of use. She looked uneasy with it, but her hands did not shake. Jonas rode ahead, scanning the horizon. He didn't say it, but he knew running would not save them. The riders wanted more than fear. They wanted blood. They reached the river by late afternoon. The water ran shallow but wide, sparkling beneath the sun. The cottonwoods stood tall along its edge, their branches whispering in the breeze. Jonas stopped there, dismounted, and listened. The land felt too quiet. He walked the bank, boots sinking into the mud, and that was when he saw it, fresh boot prints leading to the water's edge, then turning back into the trees. They were not alone. The ambush came swift. Gunfire cracked from the trees, bullets kicking up dirt near Clara's horse. She gasped but held her ground. Jonas yanked his revolver free and fired back, the echoes rolling across the valley. Riders burst from cover, 5 of them, guns flashing as they charged. Jonas ducked behind a fallen log, pulling Clara down beside him. Her breath came fast, but her grip on the rifle was steady. "Stay low," he told her, his voice hard. "Wait for the close shot." The air filled with smoke and shouting. Horses screamed as bullets found them, sending some riders tumbling into the mud. Jonas fired again, dropping one man who had raised his carbine too slow. Another circled wide, firing toward Clara. She lifted Boone's rifle, braced it against the log, and pulled the trigger. The shot roared, and the rider collapsed into the shallows, the river carrying his blood downstream. Clara froze, staring at what she had done, but Jonas grabbed her shoulder. "Look at me, not him," he said. "Breathe. Keep going." The fight raged. Jonas moved quick, firing, reloading, ducking the bullets that chewed bark and splintered wood around them. He felt the burn of a graze along his arm, but pushed through it. The riders shouted curses, their voices breaking with anger when they saw 2 against many holding them back. Another man fell when Jonas's bullet caught his chest, but the rest pressed harder. The twist came when Jonas recognized one of the faces in the smoke. A scar across the jaw, a crooked hat pulled low. It was Eli Tanner, a man Jonas had known years back at the card tables in Abilene. Tanner had once been his partner in a crooked game, until Jonas walked away with the winnings and left Tanner beaten in an alley. Now Tanner rode with the men who had killed Boone, and his pistol was pointed at Jonas with vengeance burning in his eyes. "You should have never left me alive, Hale," Tanner roared. He spurred his horse forward, firing wild. Jonas ducked, the bullets ripping the log above his head. Memories rushed back. Whiskey, cards, fists, and betrayal. Jonas had always known his past would catch him, but he hadn't expected it here on this riverbank with Clara at his side. The fight turned desperate. Clara fired again, the recoil jolting her shoulder, while Jonas scrambled for another shot at Tanner. The outlaw's bullet tore through Jonas's coat, missing flesh by inches. Jonas rolled, came up on one knee, and pulled the trigger. The shot struck Tanner's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, cursing as he crawled for cover. The other riders, seeing their leader down, pulled back toward the trees, firing as they retreated. Jonas and Clara held their ground until the last hoofbeat faded. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the river's murmur and the harsh rasp of their breathing. The bank was littered with bodies, horses tangled in the mud, guns scattered. Clara's rifle slipped from her hands as she sank to her knees. She stared at the blood staining the water, her face pale. "God forgive me," she whispered. Jonas knelt beside her, his own chest heaving. "You did what you had to," he said. But the words sounded thin, even to him. He walked to where Tanner lay wounded near the trees. The man glared up at him, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You think you've saved her? You think this ends here?" Tanner spat blood into the dirt. "We'll keep coming. As long as she breathes, we'll keep coming." Jonas aimed his revolver, but his hand shook. Killing Tanner would end one enemy, but it would also drag Jonas deeper into the life he had spent years trying to outrun. Clara's voice carried across the bank, raw and desperate. "Jonas, don't." He froze, torn between vengeance and mercy. Tanner laughed through his pain, daring him. Jonas lowered the pistol slowly, his jaw tight. "Get out," he said. "Tell the rest if they want her, they'll have to come through me." Tanner's eyes narrowed, but he staggered to his feet, stumbled to his horse, and rode off into the trees, leaving the bodies behind. Clara rose from the mud, her dress stained, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked at Jonas as if seeing him new. "You let him live," she said. Jonas nodded once. Killing him wouldn't end it. Clara's eyes filled, but not with grief this time. It was something sharper, a realization. Protection had a cost, and mercy carried its own weight. They buried the dead by the river, side by side without names. The work was grim, their hands blistered, their clothes soaked in sweat. When it was done, they sat by the water, too tired to speak. The river carried the blood away, but the memory stayed. Clara stared at the horizon, her voice low. "This won't stop, will it?" Jonas shook his head. "No, It won't. The sun dipped, shadows stretching long across the valley. Jonas knew Tanner would return, and with him more men, more blood. His oath to protect Clara had already drawn him into war, and there was no turning back. He looked at her then, at the strength beneath her sorrow, and wondered how long either of them could carry this burden. As the river whispered and the graves lay fresh behind them, Jonas Hale felt the weight of the coming storm. He did not know if mercy had spared them or doomed them, but he knew the fight was far from over. The gambler's past collided with the bride's broken future in a final duel at sunrise. The saloon that once held her tears now waited for her return, whether alone or walking beside the gambler. With his final hand dealt and his oath tested to its last breath, redemption rode on a bullet and a prayer. Only silence would decide if the promise was kept or if love died in the dust. The riverbank still smelled of gunpowder and blood when Jonas Hale and Clara Boone returned to Silverton. The town greeted them with whispers, eyes lingering on the stains in their clothes and the hollowness in their faces. Men at the saloon stopped their laughter, and women closed their curtains a little quicker. Everyone knew the fight had only begun. Jonas kept his head low, but he could feel the weight of their stares. He wasn't a deputy, wasn't a lawman. He was just a gambler who had taken a place beside a widow, and that meant the town would hold him to a fight he hadn't asked for. That night, Jonas sat alone in the saloon where it had all begun. His cards lay untouched on the table before him. He poured a drink, but didn't lift it, staring instead at the lamplight flickering on the glass. Clara was home, safe for now, but Tanner's face burned in his mind. Jonas knew the man wouldn't stop. The scarred outlaw had seen Jonas bleed once, had been left alive when Jonas could have ended him. Mercy had bought them time, not safety. The barkeep, an old man named Grady, leaned on the counter and watched Jonas in silence before finally speaking. "They'll come at dawn," he said flatly. "Always do. Men like that don't wait for dark. They want the sun at their back when the blood spills." Jonas met his eyes, seeing no fear there, only weary truth. He gave a small nod. When he stepped outside, the sky was black with stars. Clara stood on her porch, arms crossed, a lantern glowing faint in her hands. Jonas walked to her, his boots echoing on the empty street. She didn't speak until he was close. "Is it true? They'll come at dawn?" Jonas nodded once, his jaw tight. She looked away, the lantern light trembling with her hand. "Then we have hours, nothing more." She turned toward him, her voice sharp, almost angry. "Why are you still here, Jonas? This isn't your fight. You owe me nothing." The words cut him, but he didn't flinch. "I owe you everything," he said. She frowned, confusion clouding her grief. He drew a slow breath. "I've run all my life. From debts. From men I cheated. From myself. But I didn't run from you. That has to mean something." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Then she lowered her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "If you die tomorrow, it means nothing." Jonas wanted to answer, but the truth was already between them. Death was close. The night passed slow. Jonas cleaned his pistol again and again until the metal gleamed in the lamplight. Clara sat nearby, folding and refolding the shawl in her lap. Neither of them slept. Outside, Silverton lay quiet, waiting. Every creak of wood and gust of wind sounded like a warning. Jonas thought of his father's forge, the sparks flying into the night, and his mother's steady hand teaching him letters by candlelight. He thought of the crooked games, the broken promises, and the bodies left in his wake. He thought of Clara crying in the saloon, and how that sound had turned him from a drifter into something more. When the first gray light touched the horizon, Jonas rose. Clara stood too, her face pale, her eyes fierce. "Don't go alone," she said. Jonas shook his head. "This is mine." She gripped his arm, nails digging into his sleeve. "And if you fall?" Jonas looked at her hand, then at her face. "Then you live," he said. "That's the oath." He walked into the street as dawn bled across the sky. Silverton's folk had gathered at their windows, peering through cracks, holding their breath. The saloon doors swung open behind him, Grady watching in silence. The sound of hooves came next, steady and cruel. Dust rose on the edge of town, and 5 riders appeared, Tanner at their head, his shoulder bound but his eyes burning with hate. They reined in at the far end of the street. Tanner's voice carried sharp in the morning air. "Ale, you left me crawling once. You won't get the chance again." Jonas drew his pistol, the weight familiar, his hand steady. He called back, his voice even. "You should've. Stay down, Tanner." The 2 men faced each other with the town caught between them, the sun climbing slow behind the riders. Clara stood at the edge of the street, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes locked on Jonas. He felt her gaze like steel in his spine. The standoff stretched, seconds pulling long as years. Tanner's men shifted in their saddles, itching for the fight. Then Tanner moved, his pistol flashing. Jonas fired at the same instant. The crack of gunfire split the dawn. Tanner jerked back, his chest blooming red, and fell from his horse into the dust. The street exploded. The other riders drew and fired, bullets whipping through the air. Jonas dropped to one knee, firing fast, every shot measured, every breath a fight for life. A bullet grazed his side, another tore into his leg, but he held his ground. 2 riders fell, their horses screaming, but the rest pressed harder. Clara moved before anyone could stop her. She ran to the rifle Boone had left behind, bracing it against a post. Her shot rang out, striking one of the riders clean and knocking him from the saddle. Jonas glanced back, rage and fear twisting in his chest. She was exposed, but she didn't falter. The fight burned hot, then ended sudden. The last rider, seeing Tanner dead and his men broken, turned his horse and fled into the hills. Silence crashed over the town, broken only by the labored breathing of the living and the stillness of the dead. Jonas staggered, blood soaking his coat, his pistol slipping from his hand. Clara dropped the rifle and ran to him, catching him as he fell to his knees. "Stay with me," she whispered, her arms tight around him. Jonas coughed, tasting blood, but forced his eyes to hers. "Did I keep the oath?" His voice was raw, every word pulled from the edge of death. Clara's face crumpled as she held him. "Yes, Jonas, you did." The townsfolk crept out, their eyes wide, their whispers hushed. They saw Tanner dead in the dust, his men scattered, and the gambler broken, but standing by the widow he swore to protect. For the first time, Silverton was silent not from fear, but from respect. Jonas leaned against Clara, his strength fading. The saloon doors swung in the breeze, the same place where her tears had begun this story. Now the dawn painted its windows gold. Jonas wondered if he would live to see another night inside. He closed his eyes, his body heavy, his chest burning. Clara's voice was the last sound he heard, steady despite her tears. "You'll rest now. One way or another, you'll rest." And as the sun climbed higher, the question hung over Silverton like smoke. Would the gambler rise again? Or had his final hand already been played?